The amber glow of street lamps barely penetrated the pre-dawn fog as John Thompson wiped down the counter of his coffee shop for what felt like the 1,000th time. At 65, his movements were slower than they used to be, but his hands still moved with the certainty of someone who had performed this ritual for 40 years. "Another day," he muttered, glancing at the vintage clock on the wall, 5:30 a.m. The ancient coffee machine behind him hummed softly, a sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. Steam rose from its copper pipes, dancing in the dim light before disappearing into the shadows of the empty cafe. Outside, Chicago's winter wind rattled the shop's windows, carrying with it the first hints of approaching snow. The Thompson's Coffee and Bakery sign creaked gently, its once bright letters now faded by decades of sun and storm. John paused his cleaning to look through the foggy window at the empty street, remembering busier times when the morning queue would stretch around the corner. His fingers traced the edge of yesterday's ledger, its numbers telling a story he'd rather not read. Competition from trendy chain cafes had taken its toll. Fewer customers, thinner profits, and more quiet mornings like this one. Still, there was something about the old place, with its worn wooden floors and the lingering aroma of freshly ground coffee beans, that kept him coming back every day before sunrise. The first batch of morning rolls was warming in the oven, filling the air with a sweet, yeasty fragrance that mingled with the rich coffee scent. John adjusted his apron, the fabric worn soft from years of use, and began arranging cups behind the counter with mechanical precision. Each clink of porcelain against porcelain echoed in the empty space. "Just like Dad taught me," he whispered to himself, a habit he'd developed in the years since inheriting the shop. The morning routine was his anchor, a constant in a world that seemed to be changing faster than he could keep up with. Through the window's growing condensation, John caught sight of a figure shuffling slowly past the shop. The man's coat, though clean, was threadbare at the edges, and his shoulders were hunched against the cold. He paused at the window, gazing at the menu board with what looked like longing, before continuing a few steps, then stopping again. John watched as the man reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of coins that he counted carefully in the dim light. There was something dignified about him despite his worn appearance. The way he held himself, perhaps, or the careful manner in which he tucked his small change back into his pocket. After a moment's hesitation, the man turned toward the shop's door. John noticed his hands trembling slightly, though whether from the cold or nervousness he couldn't tell. The bell above the door chimed softly as it opened, bringing with it a rush of cold air and the first customer of the day. The old man stood just inside the doorway, stamping his feet gently to shake off the cold. His dark face was weathered by age and experience, but his eyes were clear and bright as they met John's. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound the gentle hum of the coffee machine and the distant rumble of early morning traffic. "Good morning," John said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "Welcome to Thompson's." The man smiled slightly, though John noticed his fingers fidgeting with something in his pocket. Probably those carefully counted coins. "Good morning," he replied, his voice soft but carrying a warmth that seemed to push back against the winter chill. "I was wondering, what's your smallest cup of coffee cost?" John glanced at the man's worn shoes, then back to his earnest face. Something about the scene stirred a distant memory. Himself as a young man, counting pennies at his father's counter, learning not just about coffee but about dignity. "Small coffee's $2, John replied, his hand automatically reaching for the smallest cup. But he paused, noticing how the old man's shoulders seemed to sink slightly at the price. The customer pulled out his coins again, this time laying them carefully on the counter. "I have $1.35, he said, his voice steady despite the admission. "Perhaps just half a cup?" The coins gleamed dully under the shop's warm lights, quarters, dimes, and nickels arranged in neat little piles. John felt something tighten in his chest as he watched the man's weathered hands arranging them with careful precision. Behind them, the timer on the oven chimed softly. The smell of fresh pastries filled the air, and John made a decision that felt as natural as his morning routine. "Tell you what," he said, reaching not for the small cup but for his largest one. "First customer of the day always gets the special brew. House tradition." The lie came easily, wrapped in warmth and spiced with kindness. The old man's eyes widened slightly. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly. I don't have enough." "Can't break tradition," John interrupted gently, already moving to his premium coffee machine. "My father would have my hide." His hands moved with practiced grace, the machine humming to life as he prepared the shop's finest roast. The rich aroma of premium coffee filled the air as John worked, sneaking glances at his customer. The old man had remained near the counter, his coins still arranged neatly, his expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Been running this shop for 40 years, John continued, his voice casual as he reached for a fresh pastry from the oven. "You learn a thing or two about coffee and people. Some mornings just call for something special." Steam rose from the large cup as John placed it on the counter, alongside a warm, flaky croissant on a small plate. "On the house," he added, gently pushing aside the neat piles of coins. "Can't have good coffee without something to go with it." The old man's hands trembled slightly as they wrapped around the warm cup. "Aye, thank you," he said softly, his eyes meeting John's. "You're very kind. Just paying forward what others did for me," John replied, thinking of his own struggles and the strangers who had shown him kindness. "There's a quiet table by the window if you'd like to sit for a while. Get warm." The man nodded, carefully picking up his cup and plate. As he made his way to the table, John noticed that despite his worn clothes, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the small shop. Morning light was just beginning to break through the fog outside as the old man settled into his seat. John watched as he took his first sip of coffee, noting the way his eyes closed in appreciation, the way his shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. The bell above the door chimed again as another customer entered, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the usual morning rush. John turned to greet them, falling back into his familiar routine. But part of his attention remained on the quiet figure by the window, savoring what he didn't know would be his last cup of coffee. As the morning crowd began to filter in, John couldn't have known that this simple act of kindness would return to him in ways he never imagined. He couldn't have known that in less than 24 hours, everything about his little coffee shop would change forever. But for now, there was just the quiet satisfaction of a small kindness freely given, the warmth of fresh coffee, and the gentle murmur of morning conversations beginning to fill his shop. The next morning arrived with the same routine, but something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the winter sun seemed brighter, or how the old coffee machine's hum sounded more cheerful. John had thought about his elderly customer throughout the evening, the memory of those carefully counted coins still tugging at his heart. At precisely 6:45 a.m., the usual quiet of Thompson's Coffee and Bakery was broken by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Not the typical economy vehicles of his regular customers, but something that made a different kind of statement altogether. Through the foggy window, John glimpsed a sleek black Mercedes-Benz, its polished surface gleaming even in the weak morning light. The bell above the door chimed, and John looked up from his coffee grounds to find himself face to face with a tall, distinguished-looking black man in an impeccably tailored suit. Something about his eyes seemed familiar, but John couldn't quite place it. "Good morning," the man said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being heard. "Are you John Thompson?" John nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. "That's me. What can I get you?" The man smiled, but there was something in his expression, a mixture of gratitude and grief that made John pause. "Actually, I'm here about a cup of coffee you served yesterday morning." To an elderly gentleman? John's heart skipped a beat. Is everything all right?" "That was my father," the man said softly, reaching into his suit jacket. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and opened it to reveal a small photograph. "His last cup of coffee, as it turns out. He passed away peacefully in his sleep last night." The words hung in the air like morning mist. John felt his throat tighten. "I'm so sorry," he managed. "Don't be," the man said, his smile growing warmer. "You see, I'm Dr. William Carter, Chief of Medicine at Metropolitan Hospital. And yesterday evening, during our weekly dinner, my father couldn't stop talking about the kind coffee shop owner who treated him with such dignity, who gave him not just any coffee but his best brew and wouldn't take his coins." John shifted uncomfortably. "It was nothing, really. To you, perhaps," Dr. Carter said, leaning slightly on the counter. "But to my father, who'd worked as a janitor at Metropolitan for 30 years, who insisted on his independence even when I begged him to let me help, it meant everything. That cup of coffee was his last taste of kindness from a stranger." He paused, reaching into his briefcase. "Which brings me to why I'm here. Metropolitan Hospital has been looking to partner with a local business for our staff coffee service. 300 healthcare workers, 3 shifts, 7 days a week." John blinked, not quite processing what he was hearing. "I don't understand." "We want your coffee shop to be our exclusive provider," Dr. Carter said firmly. "Not just because of what you did for my father, but because in that simple act of kindness, you showed exactly the kind of values our hospital stands for." The morning light streamed through the windows now, catching the steam rising from the coffee machine. John stood silent for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. "Aye, that's a very generous offer," he finally managed. Dr. Carter smiled again, this time with a hint of mischief. "Oh, I haven't even told you the budget yet. Shall we discuss the details? Over your best brew, of course." As John prepared his special brew for Dr. Carter, his hands trembled slightly. Not from age this time, but from the weight of the moment. The same coffee he'd served to an elderly man counting pennies less than 24 hours ago. He was now serving to one of the city's most prominent medical professionals. "You know," Dr. Carter began, cradling the steaming cup, "my father was the kind of man who never wanted to be a burden. Even when he could have lived comfortably with me, he chose to maintain his own small apartment. 'A man's dignity is in his independence,' he used to say." John nodded, understanding blooming in his chest. That's why he was counting coins. Exactly. Dr. Carter's eyes softened. He would save his pension for rent and utilities, insisting on earning his own coffee money by helping the neighbors with odd jobs. I tried to tell him he didn't need to, but he trailed off, taking a sip of coffee. His eyes widened slightly. "This really is exceptional coffee." "Your father thought so too," John said softly, remembering the look of appreciation on the elderly man's face. The way he savored it, I knew he understood good coffee. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long golden rays through the shop's windows. The usual early customers were beginning to trickle in, their curious glances at the well-dressed doctor and his earnest conversation with John creating a quiet buzz of speculation. "Here's my proposal," Dr. Carter said, placing a thick envelope on the counter. "Metropolitan Hospital wants to contract Thompson's Coffee and Bakery as our exclusive coffee provider. We're talking about 300 staff members across 3 shifts. Each shift would need coffee and pastry service. The contract would initially be for 2 years, with an option to extend." He opened the envelope, sliding across a document that made John's eyes widen. The figures on the page were more than he'd ever imagined seeing in his small shop's ledger. This would save the shop," John whispered almost to himself. "More than that," Dr. Carter smiled. "It would help it thrive. We'd need you to hire more staff, possibly expand your kitchen. The hospital would provide all the necessary equipment upgrades." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But that's not why I chose your shop, Mr. Thompson." John looked up from the contract, meeting Dr. Carter's steady gaze. "I chose your shop because yesterday you showed me what my father always tried to teach me. That true kindness doesn't look at the size of someone's wallet. It looks at the size of their humanity." The bell above the door chimed again, and both men turned to watch as a young nurse in scrubs hurried in, clearly running late for her shift. John automatically reached for a cup, but Dr. Carter held up his hand. "Watch this," he said with a smile, turning to address the entire shop. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The morning customers paused their conversations, turning to look at the commanding figure in the expensive suit. "My name is Dr. William Carter, Chief of Medicine at Metropolitan Hospital. Yesterday morning, the owner of this shop, Mr. John Thompson, showed extraordinary kindness to an elderly man who could barely afford a cup of coffee. That man was my father, and it turned out to be his last cup of coffee in this world." The shop had fallen completely silent. John felt his cheeks flush as all eyes turned to him. What Mr. Thompson didn't know was that this man had touched countless lives during his 30 years as a janitor at our hospital. He was known for his quiet dignity, his unwavering work ethic, and his kind heart. And in his final hours, he experienced the same kindness he had shown others all his life. Dr. Carter's voice carried through the hushed cafe. "So it gives me great pleasure to announce that starting next week, Thompson's Coffee and Bakery will be the official coffee provider for Metropolitan Hospital. Every doctor, nurse, and staff member will get to experience the same warmth and quality that my father did." Spontaneous applause broke out among the customers. The young nurse in scrubs wiped tears from her eyes, and several regulars came up to pat John on the back. "But," Dr. Carter continued, reaching into his briefcase again, "there's one more thing." He pulled out a framed photograph, the same one from his wallet, but larger. It showed his father in younger days, standing proudly in his hospital uniform. "With your permission, Mr. Thompson, I'd like to hang this here, so everyone who comes in knows the story of how one cup of coffee can change lives." John felt tears welling up in his eyes as he nodded. "There's a perfect spot," he said, gesturing to the wall near the counter. "Right where your father Saturday." As Dr. Carter hung the photograph, John noticed how the morning light caught it just right, illuminating the proud smile on the elder Mr. Carter's face. Below it, they placed a small plaque that read, "In memory of James Carter, 1945 to 2024. Every cup of coffee is an opportunity for kindness." The days that followed brought changes to Thompson's Coffee and Bakery. New equipment arrived, staff was hired, and the quiet morning shop transformed into a bustling hub of activity. Hospital workers in scrubs and white coats became a common sight, their conversations filling the air with stories of healing and hope. But some things remained the same. John still arrived before dawn each morning, still wiped down his counter with the same care, and still gave the same attention to every customer who walked through his door. And every morning, he brewed a special cup of coffee and placed it on the table beneath James Carter's photograph. A reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness can ripple out in ways we never expect. 1 month later, as John watched the sunrise through his shop window, Dr. Carter stopped by for his now regular morning coffee. "You know," he said, glancing at his father's photograph, he would have loved seeing this place now. All these people, all these conversations, all this life. John smiled, pouring Dr. Carter's usual brew. "Your father taught us both something important," he said. "Sometimes the richest moments in life have nothing to do with money, and everything to do with kindness," Dr. Carter finished, raising his cup in a small salute to his father's picture. Outside, the morning traffic hummed, and inside Thompson's Coffee and Bakery, the warmth of coffee and kindness continued to bring people together, one cup at a time.